So we've talked about aerobic respiration or cellular respiration, and that requires oxygen in order to break down glucose into CO2, H2O, and generate ATP. But what happens when your cells don't have oxygen? Are they totally screwed? Are they unable to make energy at all? Or are they able to make energy in a different way without oxygen? Well, it turns out that they're not totally screwed. There are ways to make energy without oxygen. We did already talk about one when we talked about the steps of cellular respiration. So, glycolysis does not require oxygen, and neither does fermentation. There are two types of fermentation we're going to discuss today. The first is alcohol fermentation, and the second is lactic acid fermentation. And so, in alcohol fermentation, glucose, rather than being broken down into CO2 and water, is made into CO2 and alcohol. And alcohol fermentation is not something that we can do, but other eukaryotes, in particular yeast, can do alcohol fermentation and make both CO2 and alcohol from glucose. And this fact is actually exploited by humans to make both beer and bread. And so one thing to note about fermentation is that it only makes about 2 ATP. So in the same way that glycolysis, which is an anaerobic part of cellular respiration, makes very little ATP, so does alcohol fermentation. We, however, can do lactic acid fermentation or convert glucose into lactic acid. In the process, we'll make 2 ATP. And lactic acid fermentation can be done by other organisms as well, in particular bacteria. And we exploit this in order to make certain food products like cheese and yogurt and vinegar. And for us, lactic acid fermentation occurs, and we usually associate it with muscle fatigue, because lactic acid fermentation can take place in your muscle cells when you run out of oxygen gas. And so as you exercise more, your muscle cells may not have the oxygen that they need to keep generating ATP via cellular respiration. And so they'll switch from making ATP via respiration to making ATP via lactic acid fermentation. And in the process, you'll build up a lot of lactic acid in your muscles, and that's what makes you sore after you work out. Once again, just to remind you, this fermentation only makes about 2 ATP, and so it's not quite as efficient as aerobic respiration. But there are some advantages to kind of an anaerobic or fermentation-based energy generation, and that is that it happens quickly. Because as you remember from the first part of the lecture, cellular respiration has 3 separate processes. All need to take place in order to generate that ATP. But if you just need a quick burst of energy or ATP, such as for your muscle activity while you're working out, and you don't have any oxygen, you can quickly do lactic acid fermentation and make at least some ATP. The disadvantage to this is that the byproducts of fermentation, both lactic acid and alcohol, are toxic to cells. So ultimately, too much lactic acid buildup will not only make your muscles sore, but will ultimately lead to a change in pH in your cells, which can end up denaturing your enzymes, causing your muscles to fatigue. And if yeast are in sort of this alcohol fermentation state for too long, the amount of alcohol they generate can actually kill them. And so both of these compounds are ultimately toxic, which is a disadvantage to using fermentation to generate energy all the time. In addition to the fact that the efficiency of fermentation is not as good as cellular respiration, right? And so if we're talking about the energy generated for one sugar molecule or one glucose, fermentation can only make 2 ATP for every 1 glucose molecule that it breaks down. Whereas the cellular respiration can generate 36 to 38 ATP for a single glucose molecule by using oxygen to break the sugar down. And those 36 to 38 ATP, remember, 2 come from glycolysis, 2 come from the Krebs cycle, and then the majority of them, the 34 ATP, come from that aerobic oxygen requiring electron transport chain. That's the third step of cellular respiration. And so to summarize this full group of lectures, we talked about metabolism and how metabolism is really just every chemical reaction that's happening inside your cells at a given time. Some of these processes make molecules or are anabolic. Some of them break down molecules or are catabolic. And there's a balance between anabolism and catabolism, or the making and breaking of molecules, where the catabolic reactions generate the energy that power the anabolic ones. Enzymes are specialized proteins that can speed up these metabolic reactions by lowering activation energy. The energy that's generated, or the energy currency of the cell, is ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which is a good molecule to store energy and also a good one to release it because of those unstable bonds between the phosphate groups of ATP. And in order to get the energy we need, we have to make ATP. Most of that ATP we generate comes from breaking down sugar or glucose, and the most efficient way to do that is using oxygen in a process called cellular respiration.